Along the Bosporus, a modern metropolis of glass towers and ferry lines wraps around a strait that has carried ships between Europe and Asia for thousands of years. Beneath the traffic of Istanbul, the dome of Hagia Sophia still rises above the skyline, and a long, broken line of ancient walls still cuts through the western districts of the city. Millions of people today live inside a capital where emperors once called themselves Roman, ruled in the name of Rome, and insisted for more than 1,000 years that Rome had never actually fallen. To understand how that claim survived so long, the story does not begin with the collapse of Rome in the West. It begins with a decision to move the empire's center of gravity east. By the early 4th century, the Roman Empire was too vast for any single capital in Italy to govern efficiently. The wealthiest cities, the busiest trade routes, and the most exposed frontiers all lay toward the eastern Mediterranean. And Constantine recognized that a small port town called Byzantium, set on a peninsula between the Golden Horn, the Bosporus, and the Sea of Marmara, offered something Rome itself could not: direct control over the sea lanes linking the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, and quick access to the empire's most contested borders. In the year 330, Constantine formally dedicated this rebuilt city as his new capital, and Constantinople began to absorb the palaces, churches, granaries, and government offices that had once defined imperial power in the West. Christianity grew alongside this new capital rather than arriving as a single decree. Across the 4th century, emperors increasingly positioned themselves as patrons and defenders of the Christian Church. And by the century's end, Nicene Christianity stood at the center of imperial politics, binding religious authority to the person of the emperor in a way that would define this state for the rest of its existence. When Theodosius I died in the year 395, rule of the eastern and western halves of the empire settled into 2 separate courts, an arrangement born less from a formal split than from the practical difficulty of governing such an enormous territory with one emperor. The 2 halves still considered themselves a single Roman world, but their paths diverged further with each passing decade. Through the 5th century, the Western administration lost province after province to Gothic and Vandal settlement and internal political collapse, until imperial rule in Italy itself ended in the year 476. Constantinople did not share that fate. Behind its new Theodosian land walls, a fortification system built precisely to withstand any army that could reach the approaches of the Balkans, the Eastern Court kept its treasury, its bureaucracy, and its claim to Roman legitimacy intact. A resident of 5th century Constantinople lived inside a city fed by grain shipped across the sea, entertained by chariot races at the hippodrome, and reminded constantly that the emperor stood at the center of daily life, present in processions, in coinage, and in the great churches rising across the city. A merchant could load goods bound for the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, or the overland routes toward Asia without ever leaving the harbor of a single city, a convenience few other capitals in the ancient world could offer. Its people did not think of themselves as founding something new. They still called themselves Romans, and as the Western Empire dissolved around them, Constantinople simply became the place where the Roman state continued, carrying forward its laws, its bureaucracy, and its claim to universal authority. Even's claim to universal around it changed beyond recognition. By the year 527, that Eastern Roman state was wealthier and more stable than any kingdom that had risen from the ruins of the West, and its new emperor had no intention of merely preserving what remained. Justinian inherited a capital of enormous size, its harbors crowded with grain ships, its hippodrome packed with crowds during the chariot races, its palace at the center of a government determined to restate Roman authority in the clearest possible terms. He pursued that authority through law, as much as through arms, commissioning a systematic compilation of Roman legal tradition that would later be known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, a project that preserved and organized centuries of legal thought, and would shape legal systems in Europe long after the empire that produced it had vanished. That same drive toward order nearly cost him everything in the year 532, when political resentment and rivalry between the Hippodrome's chariot factions erupted into the Nika riots, an uprising that came close to toppling his government and left much of central Constantinople in ashes. Rather than simply rebuild what had burned, Justinian used the devastation as an opportunity, and construction began almost immediately on a new church to replace the one destroyed in the unrest. By 537, a massive new dome rose over the capital, Hagia Sophia, a building so vast and so visually commanding that it became the clearest physical symbol of what Justinian believed Roman Christian power should look like. Confidence at home fed ambition abroad. Justinian's armies crossed the Mediterranean to reclaim territory the empire had lost in the west, retaking Vandal-controlled North Africa, driving deep into Italy, and securing a foothold in southern Iberia until the empire briefly commanded territory it had not held in generations. But every reconquered province required new garrisons, new fortifications, and new tax revenue to sustain them. And the Golden Age Justinian built carried the seeds of its own strain. Beginning in 541, plague spread through the empire's trade networks, even as war with Sasanian Persia and prolonged campaigns in Italy continued to drain manpower and treasure. Population, revenue, and military strength all came under mounting pressure at precisely the moment the empire's borders had grown longest. After Justinian's death, much of what his armies had won proved impossible to hold. Lombard forces pushed into Italy before the 6th century closed, and war with Persia resumed along the eastern frontier. The Roman Mediterranean that Justinian had nearly restored had already begun to fracture again, almost as soon as it reached its widest extent, leaving the empire that entered the 7th century burdened with the ambitions of a superpower, but the resources of something smaller. That contradiction nearly destroyed the empire outright. In the opening decades of the 7th century, a renewed and increasingly desperate war against Sasanian Persia pushed deep into Byzantine territory, with Persian forces overrunning provinces in the east and advancing into Anatolia itself, while political instability weakened the government in Constantinople. Heraclius eventually turned the tide, driving a remarkable counteroffensive that forced Persia by the year 628 to return most of the land it had seized. On a map, it looked like total vindication. In reality, both empires had exhausted themselves in the process, and neither had any reserve of strength left for what came next. Within a few short years, armies from Arabia began advancing out of the peninsula with startling speed, and across the 630s and 640s, the empire lost Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, and soon afterward its remaining territory in North Africa as well. This was not simply a loss of land on a map. Egypt alone had long supplied vital grain and revenue to the imperial system, and ancient centers such as Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, cities that had defined the Roman Mediterranean for centuries, no longer answered to Constantinople at all. The empire that had nearly reclaimed the West within living memory now found itself stripped of most of the wealthy provinces that had made it a Mediterranean power in the first place. What remained was a smaller, harder core centered on Anatolia, Constantinople, and a shrinking foothold in the Balkans. And that core had to reorganize itself, almost from the ground up. Constant pressure on the frontiers gradually reshaped how the empire governed and defended its remaining territory, giving rise over time to new regional military structures known as themes. Though this transformation unfolded gradually across the 7th century, rather than through any single sweeping reform, Constantinople itself came under direct siege more than once, most seriously between the years 717 and 718, when its walls, its navy, and coordinated defense held against an Arab assault that might otherwise have ended the empire entirely. The same geography that had once made the city an ideal trading capital now made it an almost unbreakable fortress, and that advantage would save the empire again and again in the centuries to come. Even as the frontier stabilized, the empire turned against itself over questions of faith. Beginning in 726, and continuing intermittently until 843, imperial policy toward the veneration of religious images divided monasteries, clergy, and the imperial court in a controversy shaped by theology, politics, and military crisis together, rather than any single cause. When the veneration of icons was finally restored in 843, it marked more than a religious resolution. By then, the empire that emerged from a century and a half of loss, war, and internal division bore little resemblance to Justinian's Mediterranean state. Its government now operated primarily in Greek. Its territory was smaller but more defensible. Its identity remained unmistakably Roman in political terms. Yet its culture had become something new, an Orthodox Christian, Greek-speaking medieval state built from the wreckage of a much larger ancient one. That contraction, painful as it was, gave the empire something Justinian's overextended Mediterranean state had never fully possessed: a defensible, coherent core that could be rebuilt with purpose. From the middle of the 9th century onward, political consolidation and stronger military organization allowed Constantinople to shift gradually from pure defense toward calculated offense, and the frontier in Anatolia began, for the first time in generations, to move in the empire's favor. Stability at home brought wealth, and wealth brought a resurgence in law, scholarship, and the arts that historians often call the Macedonian Renaissance, visible in illuminated manuscripts, restored mosaics, and churches once again filled with imagery after the long dispute over icons had ended. Byzantine influence expanded even where Byzantine armies did not march. Missionaries and church networks carried Constantinople's religious and cultural traditions into Bulgaria, across the Balkans, and into the lands of the Rus, so that an entire Orthodox cultural sphere grew far larger than the empire's own borders, bound together by faith and liturgy rather than by direct rule. On the battlefield, commanders such as Nikephoros II Phocas and John I Zimisces led campaigns that recovered Crete, Cyprus, and territory along the eastern frontier, turning what had been a defensive posture for centuries into sustained, deliberate expansion. That momentum reached its height under Basil II, whose decades-long campaigns against the Bulgarian state culminated in the year 1018 with the return of most of the Balkans to imperial authority. When Basil II died in 1025, Byzantium stood as one of the dominant powers of the Balkans and the Middle East, its borders more secure than they had been in centuries, its treasury full, its army formidable. It was, by nearly every visible measure, an empire that had beaten the odds against it. And that very success concealed a dangerous dependence on strong, capable leadership at the center, a weakness that would become devastatingly clear within a single generation. The instability began almost immediately. No successor matched Basil II's authority, and rivalry among court factions, military aristocratic families, and short-lived emperors left frontier strategy without consistent direction at the very moment external pressure was increasing. Norman forces struck at Byzantine possessions in Italy. Pecheneг raids pressed against the Balkans, and Turkic groups pushed steadily deeper into Anatolia. In 1071, this accumulating pressure produced two disasters in the same year. In the east, Emperor Romanos IV was defeated and captured by Seljuk forces at the Battle of Manzikert. And in the west, Bari, the last major Byzantine stronghold in southern Italy, fell to the Normans. The defeat at Manzikert did not by itself annihilate the Byzantine army, as it is sometimes remembered. What truly devastated the empire's position was the civil conflict that followed. As rival factions fought for the throne, while Turkish groups steadily settled and took control of the Anatolian interior largely unopposed. Within roughly a single generation, the empire lost command of the heartland that had supplied much of its soldiers, its grain, and its tax revenue. A staggering reversal from the security Basil II had left behind only decades earlier. Recovery came through Alexios, the first Komnenos, who took the throne in 1081 and forced through the reforms, alliances, and financial reorganization needed to stabilize the state and reclaim territory along the Balkan frontier. Seeking additional military strength, Alexios appealed to Western Europe for assistance, a request that became one of the sparks behind the First Crusade, beginning in 1096. Byzantine and Crusader forces cooperated at times and clashed at others, divided by different goals, expectations, and political traditions, even as successive Komnenian emperors restored much of the empire's prestige. Yet commercial privileges, granted to Venetian and Genoese merchants, combined with intensifying competition across the Mediterranean, left Byzantium increasingly dependent on outside powers it could not fully control. That dependence turned catastrophic in the Fourth Crusade, which was diverted toward Constantinople through a tangled chain of Crusader debt to Venice, Byzantine dynastic politics, and the promises of a rival claimant to the throne, rather than any original intention to attack a fellow Christian capital. In 1204, the Crusaders breached the city's defenses, sacked Constantinople, and installed a Latin emperor in its place. For the first time since Constantine had made it new Rome, the city held no Roman emperor at all. Yet the story of the empire did not end there. It simply moved outside the walls of its own capital. In the years after 1204, Byzantine political life scattered into competing successor states. As Latin rulers held Constantinople, while Greek-speaking claimants to the imperial title established rival courts at Nicaea, Epirus, and Trebizond. Among these, Nicaea, based in western Anatolia, built the most effective government in exile, sustained by enough territory, institutions, and revenue to keep the Roman imperial claim alive, even without its historic capital. As Latin rule weakened financially and militarily, Nicaea grew stronger, and in 1261, forces under Michael VIII Palaiologos retook Constantinople, restoring a Byzantine emperor to the city after 57 years of absence. A striking symbolic triumph. But restoration did not mean recreation. Western powers had absorbed many former Byzantine territories, and Venice and Genoa now dominated much of the trade that once passed through imperial hands, leaving the restored empire with a far smaller navy and treasury than before. Constantinople had its emperor again, but it no longer set the terms of Mediterranean commerce the way it once had. Michael VIII concentrated his limited resources on defending the recovered capital and Balkan interests against the continuing threat of a Latin reconquest, and that focus came at a cost. the Anatolian frontier received far less attention, just as new Turkish principalities, including the small but rapidly growing Ottoman Principality, began expanding across the region. The capital had been saved, but the Asian heartland kept slipping away, a bitter irony at the heart of the restored empire's fortunes. Even as political and military strength contracted, cultural and intellectual life continued to flourish under the Palaiologan dynasty, sustained by what remained of court, church, and elite patronage. Byzantine religious and cultural influence continued to reach communities far beyond the empire's shrinking borders, even as the empire itself controlled less territory than at almost any point in its history. The Byzantines had recovered their city. They had not recovered the world that had once sustained it, and as territory and revenue kept contracting, internal political rivalry grew more dangerous than any external enemy, setting the stage for factions that would soon invite foreign armies into conflicts they could no longer control on their own. By the early 14th century, Byzantium still held Constantinople, along with scattered territories across Thrace, the Balkans, and Greece. But its revenue and military strength were a fraction of what they had once been, and its capital's long walls now enclosed far fewer people and soldiers than they had been built to defend. Beginning in 1341, a bitter civil war tore through the imperial court, driven by rival claims to the throne, and it left the treasury drained, authority fractured, and competing factions dependent on Serbian or Turkish military support to survive against one another. That desperate reliance on Turkish forces gave the Ottomans a foothold in Europe itself, most notably at Gallipoli in 1354, expanding their ambitions beyond Anatolia and gradually surrounding Constantinople from both the Asian and European sides at once. In the decades that followed, Byzantine emperors turned increasingly to Western Europe for aid and, at times, to uneasy accommodation with Ottoman rulers, since the empire no longer possessed the independent strength to defend itself alone. Negotiations for union with the Roman Church became as much a survival strategy as a matter of faith, one that provoked deep controversy among an Orthodox population wary of compromise. Ottoman pressure eased briefly after their defeat by Timur in 1402, but Byzantium no longer had the manpower, land, or revenue left to convert that unexpected reprieve into any lasting recovery, and when the Ottoman state reunified, the pressure resumed as before. In 1453, Sultan Mehmed II laid siege to Constantinople, whose defenders relied on the ancient Theodosian walls, a chain stretched across the Golden Horn, and whatever limited foreign assistance could reach them, against an Ottoman force with far greater manpower, and, for the first time, powerful siege artillery trained directly on walls that had turned back attackers for over 1,000 years. On the 29th of May, 1453, those walls were finally breached, and Constantine XI died in the final defense of his city. The Byzantine imperial government at Constantinople came to an end, and Hagia Sophia, the great dome built after the fires of the Nika riots 9 centuries earlier, was converted into a mosque. Some Byzantine successor territories lingered briefly beyond that date, but the central imperial story that had run continuously from Constantine to Constantine closed there, on the shores of the Bosporus. The Roman emperor vanished from Constantinople that day, but the civilization built around that office did not vanish with him. Return today to the same street, and the layers remain visible beneath the modern city. The Theodosian walls still standing in broken stretches, the dome of Hagia Sophia still commanding the skyline, ancient cisterns still resting beneath city streets, and an Orthodox Christian world stretching far beyond the borders of modern Turkey that still traces its faith and its liturgy back to Constantinople. Roman law, organized and preserved under Justinian, still echoes through legal systems that never saw Constantinople's walls, and Greek manuscripts carried west by Byzantine scholars, fed into a broader current of learning that helped shape the European Renaissance, even if Byzantium alone did not create it. Byzantium endured for more than 1,000 years, not because it avoided change, but because, each time its old form became unworkable, it allowed itself to be remade into something smaller, harder, and better suited to the world around it. A Mediterranean superpower became a fortress state. A fortress state became an expanding medieval power, and a shattered empire of exiles became a modest, walled remnant clinging to one city on the water. It only ended when there was no longer enough land, revenue, or time left to remake itself once more.